The Unwanted, Chapter 27. Year is 1981, and Kian is 14 years old. My grandmother stopped talking. The only sounds she made were moans. She barely recognized any members of her family. She stopped eating, except for a few drops of soup my grandfather forced down her throat. As she got sicker, her bladder and digestive tract stopped working. In bed, she passed her bodily waste continuously. Nobody in my aunt's family helped us to take care of her. The stench of her illness became part of our existence. Even my mother's patience was challenged on numerous occasions. After being cleaned up, my grandmother would soil herself on her cheap tatami mat again. Sometimes I could hear my mother's frustrated scream from the front of the house, cursing my aunt's family for not helping her and cursing my grandmother's cruelty for being alive in such a pitiful condition. My grandmother lay motionless for days, looking without recognition at my grandfather through her crusty eyelids. As she drifted away, an incessant stream of gibberish came out of her mouth. She grasped wildly at invisible objects. Jimmy and I sat on the floor a few meters away, watching her delirium and wishing for death to take her quickly. One afternoon, I came home from the seaport, drenched in fish blood. As I walked through the thick wild grass of my aunt's garden, I heard my grandmother calling for me. Her lucid voice surprised me, and I paused at her window to look inside. She was lying on her back and staring at the ceiling. Her hair was mostly gone, revealing her whitish, wrinkled scalp. She was naked. Her hands froze in mid-air, catching an invisible butterfly. She defecated, and her feces mixed with her urine to drip from her mat to the cement floor below. She lifted her head to meet my gaze, and her lips trembled as she called out my name. I wanted to rush to her side, but somehow my feet were buried deep in the ground. I wanted to call out for help, but the words were trapped inside my parched throat. I saw 2 lines of red ants along her legs, feeding on her flesh. Eerily, I wondered how long they had been there. Her eyes never left my face. Her voice weakened as she begged for my help. Her hands dropped down on top of her sagging breasts. Then, with one last rasping breath, she was gone. I started to scream. At first, the cry that escaped my throat sounded like a broken duck whistle. I sucked in air and tried again. The next sound that came from my lungs was so foreign to my ears, I wondered if it belonged to someone else. Nevertheless, I couldn't stop. From her room, moonlight ran outside. Seeing me at my grandmother's window with my finger pointing into her bedroom, she understood immediately. She too began to scream. The news of my grandmother's death spread through the village. My grandfather had gone out for his usual walk, and my mother was at the market. By the time they came back, a crowd had gathered in front of the compound. The news did not seem to surprise my grandfather. Without a word, he closed himself behind the bedroom door to be alone with the corpse. The rest of us stood outside and waited in silence. Nobody in either family shed a tear. Night was falling and the sun melted over the red tile roofs. More and more people were coming to my house. The town commander came up behind my mother. His face was inches away from her hair. "I am so sorry about your loss," he said to her. "We are here to help you with the funeral arrangements." My mother didn't look up. "Thank you," she muttered, "but we can manage. We wouldn't want to trouble you." "No trouble at all. It is the town's responsibility to take care of its citizens. Your mother is a part of the community," he said. "It's okay, sir." My mother looked up. "You may be our community leader, but you have also worked so hard to relocate your wife and daughter from Hanoi. They are finally here after 15 years. It's only right that you should be home celebrating with them. We can take care of our own misfortune." My aunt interrupted. "Shut up, sister. Let the honorable comrade do his job." "Your sister's right." The community leader looked hurt. But if you don't want me here, I'll leave. It's been our country's tradition to pay respect to the dead. I've ordered the town to prepare for the ceremony. Tonight I give everyone permission to help your family. You have my deepest sympathy and best wishes." He turned and exited through the front gates. An hour later, a group of men from the funeral home arrived. With my grandfather's help, they cleaned my grandmother's body and marinated it in rice alcohol. When the wine had straightened her limbs, which had stiffened from rigor mortis, they dressed her in new clothes. Using a thick red thread, they tied her 2 big toes together to prevent her spirit from wandering. A cheap red lacquered coffin was brought into my grandparents' bedroom. A layer of sand was spread at the bottom to cushion the body. Rich families would use tea leaves instead of sand. The more expensive the tea, the richer and higher in status the dead were. We covered the sand with coarse, loosely woven cotton gauze. After my grandmother's body was laid inside the coffin, a small dish filled with burning oil was placed on the ground beneath it to keep her spirit warm. Incense in a large urn perfumed the air. It was time for friends and relatives to pay their respects. That night, my family slept by the coffin to keep my grandmother company. On the cold cement, Mrs. Duong and my mother were discussing the details of my grandmother's burial. Lying next to them, Jimmy and I slowly drifted to sleep. Mrs. Duong leaned over to my mother and whispered in her ear. Drowsily, I heard her every word. "Are your sons asleep, Guhan?" "I think so. Why?" my mother answered. "I don't want them to hear this, but I am leaving soon." "What do you mean? Leaving my house or planning to escape?" "Planning," she whispered. "I found a connection. The owner of the boat will allow me to take one more person with me. My parents are too old and live in Saigon. Since I have no one else, I can take one of your sons. You have to decide which of the boys you want to let go." I lay quiet, but inside I screamed out to my mother, begging her to pick me over my brother. Her silence drove me wild with anticipation. I could barely keep still. Then I heard my mother murmur, "How much will it cost?" "Not a dime. We are good friends, aren't we? It's my way to say thank you, darling." "How long do I have before I must give the answer?" "A month. You can decide after the funeral." "Let's talk about something else," my mother said.